The God Hand is one of the most fascinatingly evil group of fictional characters ever created, and a big reason for its persistent grip on the collective imagination of millions of manga readers over 3.5 decades is the fact that their true purpose and motives remain mostly shrouded in mystery. Aside from being a masterclass for aspiring storytellers out there about the power of giving away as little as possible, this small council of archdemons provides the equivalent of a Rubik cube for fans of the Berserk world. But just like any brain teaser, I think it can be solved with a bit of persistence, and I'm going to share with you my theories about the reason for their existence. Anyone who studies storytelling eventually comes across the notion that we, as humans, are hardwired for stories, because stories help us give meaning to the world around us. The human brain is a marvelous machine shaped by the billions of years of evolutionary pressure, and its most significant function is to search for patterns. Patterns are signals it endlessly looks for through sensory organs because they are the key for survival. Patterns can mean either danger or opportunity, and when the burden of survival shifts from the individual to the group, the most important patterns become those that guarantee collective survival through cooperation. Stories are exactly that. They perform the function of carrying patterns of group survival and annihilation in the form of meaning, so that the group or tribe can discriminate between them. They also serve the need of species survival, because they can be taught through time from generation to generation. Those who come across this biological and evolutionary framework to interpret storytelling also quickly learn that villains are essential to a story. The world evolves constantly, and we cannot survive without change. Since story is about change, villains represent the obstacle to change, and as a logical consequence, they represent obstacles to individual, group, and species survival. No matter how much I hate generalizations, the undeniable evidence is that at its core, almost all of the stories ever conceived contain a simple and specific message, and that message is that the pack survives and the individual perishes. Our species is inherently social, and at some point in prehistory we realized that we should teach ourselves and to our progeny that taking care of our kin in the long run always beats selfishness and individualism. That's why deep down we are so attracted to the bad guy. We know he or she is the obstacle that must be overcome, and makes us shiver in anticipation of the emotional and psychological satisfaction we will feel and want to feel when the protagonist will prevail. A good villain is someone who somehow provides a distorted mirroring of our protagonist. The hero is defined by the antagonist or villain, and the theme emerges organically from the conflict between them. The antagonist can be a human, a monster, or a natural phenomenon devoid of conscious agency, but it must carry out the specific function of standing between the protagonist and his or her goal. But, as William Faulkner said, and George R.R. Martin later popularized, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. This conflict within us stems from a big disparity between what we want psychologically and what we need emotionally or spiritually to change into the better version of ourselves. And those two things often do not coincide, at the cost of sounding preachy and banal. A good example of this conflict is the typical scenario of how we make our happiness depend upon an external event, like the car of our dreams, a beautiful partner, or a job promotion, for instance, while what we truly need is to understand that we must learn to be happy regardless and enjoy every single moment. This long introduction is necessary to explain why the God Hand is one of the greatest foes ever created in any media. They define our protagonist gods, because they are so overpowering that his struggle seems almost ridiculously unfeasible. They define him because they keep making it harder and harder for him to change. Not only do they represent an obstacle of cosmic proportions, but they are also very nuanced villains with obscure motivations, but a fairly clear set of rules. Most importantly, after being shown the entire life of only one of them, Griffith, aka Femto, we can infer with great certainty that each of the other four had a tragic backstory, but we don't know what it is and are therefore endlessly enthralled by their mystique. So how can we figure out their true purpose? I think there is only one way, and that is by understanding that despite Guts and Griffith's personal history, the God Hand is not Guts' main adversary. They are Guts' opponents, obviously, but the ultimate enemy is the idea of evil. To figure out the God Hand, we must first figure out the Dark Lord of the Berserk universe. As you all know, we witnessed the Eclipse event from different points of view, including that of Griffith. Episode 82 of the Golden Age arc is titled God of the Abyss, and at the end of it, we see Griffith descend into the depths of the astral world. The subsequent episode, number 83, and titled God of the Abyss 2, was later decanonized by Sensei Miura himself because he felt it gave too much away too early. I will not question his decision out of respect and, quite frankly, adoration for his genius. But even though it feels a little bit like cheating, I believe that episode is the key to interpreting the God Hand's ultimate purpose. The big question we must ask ourselves is not what the idea of evil is, but why did Kentaro Miura remove episode 83? I believe his exact words, at least after translation from Japanese to English, were that it gave too much of the plot away too early. I'm sure he meant that, but could there possibly be something we haven't read between the lines here? The question I keep asking myself is, what if episode 83 gave too much away about his theme for the series? Another huge topic in the abstract science of storytelling is that of theme. Every story should have a theme, but what is it exactly? Well, theme is a moral or ethical principle that the author of that story wants to convey. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, but there must be a message in the story. It could be as simple as war is bad or life sucks, but it should be there for the audience to investigate about. Some of you might ask, wait a second, didn't you say that most stories teach us that selfish is bad and altruistic is good? Yes, I said exactly that, but I didn't mean that it is required. What I meant is the overwhelming majority of past and present storytellers have conveyed that message regardless of the medium at hand, and therefore it means that most humans feel that way. And make no mistake, Sensei Miura had a positive theme for his dark fantasy masterpiece, but like all the greatest, he had a keen understanding of the other rule regarding theme. It must emerge organically from the story's main conflict. If it is expressed too openly and directly, it becomes preachy, and it can detract the audience from the story itself. Humans don't like being preached to, and we are far more open to absorbing moral principles, or at least entertain them, by seeing them in action instead of listening to them being told through words. Another feel where the old adage, show don't tell, applies. So what is Miura's real theme for the series? I know this could be a contentious point, but I have pondered this for a very long time, and I have many solid reasons to think the entire series is a deep meditation about authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes can be either political or religious or both, but they always stem from, guess what, an idea. The idea could be that a certain book contains the absolute truth, that a certain group of people is intrinsically better than another group, or that a specific economic system will provide wealth and power for everyone, but an idea has no power without followers. Knowing that I'm venturing into controversial topics, I posit that every single authoritarian regime throughout history was created as a bad answer to a real problem shared by the lower classes. Whether poverty, hardship, real or perceived external threats, someone always capitalizes on the idea shared by a big enough group of people that they are victims of something or someone. Regimes are never built in a day. They creep in slowly and build enough momentum to later crush every form of opposition and dismantle every form of institution standing in the way of its full actualization. And they always do it thanks to a widespread support by the masses. Also, an authoritarian regime always establishes itself through a few key figures who interpret the idea in various areas of society, with one of them being perceived by the masses as the savior, the one who can do no wrong, and who will save them from the enemy. The supporters of these figures get so emotionally invested in the idea that they become impervious to any fact or rational argument, showing the hypocrisy, inconsistency, and danger behind that idea. So much, in fact, that the metaphor of blind sheep applies. But remember, the idea behind any authoritarian regime is wrong and bad for all minorities in the long run. It is intrinsically rotten, and it only has one way to keep going, and that is to keep spreading. No rational opposition is tolerated, lest the supporters figure out the wrong behind their ways. For this reason, once the regime takes hold, the only way to continue is to expand to more followers. It's not hard to see that throughout the manga, Sensei Miura has portrayed monotheistic religions and feudal systems as intrinsically violent and unfair, but the new system brought forth by the Falcon of Light is much, much worse once someone peeks behind the curtain of safety and harmony. It's worth remembering that in the Berserk world, humans are playthings for the apostles who are created by the idea of evil. The war with the Kushans was initiated by an apostle. Thousands were slaughtered by apostles and under an apostle's command. And during the Fantasia arc, people are flocking to Griffith's capital to be protected by mythical creatures unleashed onto the world by Griffith himself. This is the great illusion that the blind sheep are willing to submit to. Much like gangsters who extort money from small businesses in the name of protection when actually they are the only real threat, Griffith collects worship from his subjects when he is the real cause of their predicament. He created the conditions for humans to believe he is the only solution. My theory is that Kentaro Miura wanted to show in his story how every single authoritarian regime makes things worse than what they actually were before, and as long as enough people perceive themselves as victims, there is margin for these regimes to arise. He was extremely clever because he knew that the fantasy genre was already full of dark lords, and that creating another character who is simplistically evil would not convey his theme and message with enough power, so he devised a metaphysical entity who is never at the forefront, but has created many different levels in a hierarchy of individuals to carry out its will. From this standpoint, it becomes quite easy to understand what the idea of evil ultimate purpose is: survival. We are told in episode 83 that this dark entity was born from the need of millions to have a justification for their suffering. I think the fundamental conflict in this dark fantasy epic stems from the opposition between a theistic and a secular view of the world. We are exposed to many characters throughout the series who are born into difficult conditions, but the counterintuitive evidence is that the suffering depends upon the subjective perception of said conditions. In fact, we get to see several nobles who suffer despite their material wealth. Apostles come from every different class of every different culture or society in the Berserk world, but it could be argued that the one who endured the worst conditions is our protagonist, Guts, and yet he has chosen not to dwell on his misfortune, but to accept that he had no choice in the matter. As I explained in my video about the possible evolution for the rest of the story, I think the Buddhist concept of acceptance is extremely important here. Those who do not accept the adversities in their life are always looking for a savior and are prone to become cogs in an evil dictatorship. On the other hand, Those who accept the adversities and try to do better for themselves and for others, no matter what, do not need saviors. They are strong and very hard to gaslight, and therefore represent a danger to authoritarian regimes. They might feel lonely most of the time because, well, they are few and far between. They may face incredible hardships in opposing the regime, but they always carry the potential to awaken the blind sheep. The idea of evil wants one thing and one thing only: to keep existing. It knows that the more people like guts there are within humanity, the more likely it is to slowly fade away from existence, and therefore it wants to perpetuate the spiritual ignorance of the masses. It is through this lens that the God Hand must be interpreted. They are the servants of the idea of evil, and their ultimate goal is to allow it to keep existing. It may be somewhat of an underwhelming explanation, but it's the only one that makes sense given the many breadcrumbs left by the author within the 364 episodes he created. The idea has worked incessantly since it came into existence to prepare the world for Griffith's kingdom, and even to create Griffith's lineage. The other God Hand members have carried out this task, and as the not-so-subtle but extremely effective metaphor of a hand, they collectively represent the executive power of the idea. But there is something to be said about the true extent of their knowledge regarding their master's true plan. While keeping the authoritarian regime theme as an intellectual backdrop, I'd like to point out that just as Sensei Miura incorporated many different historical and religious elements in his work, I think he was not basing this metaphysics of evil on one particular regime, but studied the most infamous ones. One recurrent aspect in these regimes is that every tyrant has a small group of lieutenants, and that despite their loyalty and fervor, they are never completely aware of all the details of the tyrant's plan. A dictator is by definition a sociopath with an enormous ego who pretends to care about their closest allies, but in the end is willing to let them go at any moment if they're not useful anymore. And history shows us that when push comes to shove, someone within that small circle always ends up betraying the tyrant, because they realize the boss doesn't really care about anyone beside themselves. This is often seen also in fantasy series like Harry Potter and The Lord of the Rings, where the Dark Lord's main reasons for demise are underestimating the adversaries, and the fact that subordinates follow them out of fear, not love, and are prone to betrayal. Their own priorities do not coincide with the Dark Lord's. So, the God Hand members, in my opinion, are simply following a plan they do not fully comprehend, because A, they are subjected to the same kind of instinctual obedience towards the idea that apostles have towards them, as seen with Emperor Ganishka versus Griffith, and B, they think there is something in store for each of them in the new world that the idea of evil wants to create. But I am quite convinced that the idea of evil lied to each and every one of them to get them to become archdemons, the same way apostles are told that they can do what they want, but in reality are subservient to their superiors and are merely used as soldiers in the execution of the idea's plan. The most plausible explanation here is that the idea tricked each of the five by catering to their selfish desires, but ultimately has no love for any of them. Well, if love is a concept that applies to a metaphysical entity of this magnitude, but only needs them to achieve its goal. But here's the kicker. As I explained in a previous video, I believe the law of causality in the Berserk world symbolizes ego. The fact that it's called causality and the idea told Griffith it was born because humans wanted a reason, or in other words, a cause for their suffering, should tell us something about the ultimate plan. Causality and the abyss, where the idea resides, are often presented to us both visually and verbally as water and bodies of water. The abyss is an ocean, causality is a river, and the merging of the real world with the astral world is called a great wave. I won't pretend to know the exact mechanics of this system, but it seems to me that causality flows not in one but in two directions. The souls of those who died with regrets and suffering flow towards the abyss. while causality flows from the idea to the real world through intermediate layers and preferential channels called dragon channels, such as the baelids. And the idea of evil is shown as a gigantic lump of flesh pumping causality liquid through giant valves. I think the resemblance to a heart is not lost on anyone here. So causality is a liquid more similar to blood than water, and blood flows to and from the heart. I've often thought about this, and there's this idea I can't get rid of. Let's review a few facts about the manga. We know a huge chunk of humanity is amassing in Falconia. The most likely reason for this is that there is a ritual in store that could dwarf Griffith's Eclipse in size. We know this realm is only part of the world, with more continents unknown or unexplored. We know this is a feudal system, where royalty is passed through blood or through anointment by the highest religious authority. Griffith is keeping Charlotte in the capital and most likely plans to marry her. What if the idea wants to incarnate itself in a son conceived by Griffith and Charlotte through a gigantic ritual where all the people in Falconia are sacrificed, and later create a realm of terror that will feed its existence eternally through suffering? Doesn't it make sense for the god born of humanity, because they need a reason for their suffering, to become its literal and material instigator? It was created as an effect of human misery, and it aims to become its cause. This engenders some very interesting questions about the God Hand members, because it seems their true destiny is to be either servants in this world, or simply to be destroyed by the Dark Lord once they are no longer useful. After all, as clearly stated during the eclipse, they are not gods themselves, and none of them, not even Void, can understand and foresee all the flowings of causality. One aspect that could further corroborate this theory is that we get to see 4 previous God Hand members through the memories stored in the Berserker armor. Where are they? And is it just me, or are there 6 eclipses in 1060 years, not 5, with the first corresponding to 0? What if what we saw was not the eclipse that turned Void into an archdemon, but the first attempt by the idea to incarnate self directly, which was thwarted by Geyserik? What if the idea of evil had to consume the other 4 demons for their ritual? Or maybe Geyserik managed to kill one when it needed to consume 5, and the cycle had to begin anew, with a different plan, getting one of the God Hand to incarnate first and pave the way, so to speak. One last thing before closing this video. I see more and more details pointing to the possibility that one or more of the current God Hand members will turn against their master, and the best clue could be hidden in the hand symbolism. Each member is always shown resting upon a specific finger, and as far as I know, this order has never changed. Without having to resort to Chinese traditional medicine, I think a less complex and more popular symbolism applies. The thumb, in my opinion, symbolizes planning and understanding, because it is thanks to an opposable thumb that we can grab or grasp things. So Void is the main executor of the idea's master plan and could actually know the full details. He is, by all intents and purposes, the prophet. The pinky finger, well, I didn't know much about it, but I've read that it is commonly associated with persuasion, and we have seen Conrad using pestilence to persuade people to congregate at the Tower of Albion. He represents the brute force and dirty tactics used by authoritarian regimes behind the curtain of public perception. The ring finger represents commitment, and Ubik symbolizes the propaganda used to spread the ideology to the public through press and books and, you guessed it, fake news and conspiracy theories. The index finger represents ambition, because we use it to point towards where we want to go, and it is also associated with leadership. Griffith is the ambitious and charismatic leader of the revolution that will usher the new system. And what about the middle finger? Well, the middle finger has 2 different meanings. The most honorable one is balance and spirituality, and Slan could interpret the good-faced veneer of the new system, the promise of justice and abundance for everyone in the new world. But we all know the middle finger in Western societies has represented sexual intercourse due to its resemblance to an erect, and a defiant insult for almost 2 millennia. In my opinion, Slan represents the most voluble part of the God Hand, and she could be the first giant middle finger thrown in rebellion at the idea of evil and its master plan, if Guts doesn't kill her first, that is. Well, there's quite a bit of meat in the fire in this video. Please let me know in the comments if there's any topic you would like me to elaborate on further in other videos, and if you agree with these theories or not, and if you would like to know more about what I think will happen between Slan and Guts, check out this video. Thank you guys all for watching, and I will see you in the next one.